Okay, so first of all, I just want to say that although we're using the word Imari and it does get used to apply to Wileman, that's technically not correct. We should only call the Wileman range Japan. The original Imari was exported from Japan in the beginning to the late 17th century. The Dutch East India Company suggested to Japan that they would do really well to export wares of a European taste. Japan actually didn't start making earthenware until some Korean prisoners of war found kaolin clay near the port town of Imari, which is now modern-day Arita. And that's when it all started. So then these original Imari wares were exported to England and to Europe. As you can see, they're very beautiful. They often contained pictures of birds, foliage, scenes from nature, beautifully dressed women in kimonos were often depicted as well. You can see that the colour palette basically revolved around cobalt blue, terracotta and gold. So this Imari ware is now, we shouldn't confuse Wileman Imari with this Imari because they are millions of dollars and a couple of centuries apart. But this is where Wileman got their inspiration from. These wares became so successful, in fact, that other potteries in Europe started to make imitations. And this plate here is a Meissen plate. It's not Japanese at all, but it sold for, I think, something like $22,000 a couple of years ago. Okay, so you can see in this picture that Wileman, these gnarly looking trees here, and also the flower and the border decorations are directly based on what we've just been looking at in the Japanese originals. With the firing, first of all, the Japanese Imari and Wileman also underwent 3 separate firings. The first vessel, was decorated with underglaze blue, which is cobalt oxide mixed with water. And then the other colour was added to that and then put in the, do we call it an oven? No, the heat. But fired again, and then the last thing that was added was the gold, which was then also fired. So you can see in these 3 examples the actual process taking place with those 3 firings. This one is one of my own collection, and I don't know if it's a pattern that just didn't go in for the 3rd time for the gilding, or if it was meant to look like this. Perhaps someone a bit cleverer than me can tell us that. So, as I said, Western imitations came along, and some of them are now just as expensive as the original Imari. A little bit later, still before Wileman, other potteries in Britain started producing their own Imari wares, the main one of which was Royal Crown Derby. Now, Royal Crown Derby still produce Imari patterns. So if you look at their record books, they've never stopped making Imari patterns, and it's still very popular for them. Coalport also made Imari. So then Japan closed off to the west, as you know, and so there was a gap then where there was no original wares coming out from Japan. And it wasn't until about the 1850s when Japan opened up again that they started re-sending Imari ware. But that is when the English potteries really moved into high gear and started producing their Imari ware. Partly because of the big exhibitions in both Britain and Europe that showcased Japanese culture. So by the 1860s, no great home of England was without its Japanese screen, its Japanese fan, and its Japanese pottery. So to make it more available, I guess, and to make money, Wileman then entered the market. So this is the very first Japan pattern, 3424 on the Worcester and Victoria shapes. And they also, this was under the old diamond mark system. So I just want to, we'll go back to Wileman a little bit later, but just so that we understand, Wileman didn't just slap on the three colours in, you know, whatever pattern they thought looked oriental. They actually studied Japanese design, Japanese woodblock prints, Japanese kimono patterns to arrive at the designs on their wares. First of all, I'm going to talk about aspects of Japanese design which influenced Wileman's design, and that is colour, line, the use of flowers, and some of the Japanese, I guess, philosophies that went behind those design elements. First of all, let's talk about colour. Gold was associated with power, with royalty, and with the spiritual world. And we see a lot of gold, of course, on Wileman Imari. That's part of the palette. Cobalt blue, terracotta, and gold. Some wares have got more gold on them than others, and I guess the more gold that was on them, the more expensive they would have been. In Japan, black was associated with death, but it was also associated with night and the cycle of life. And Wileman has used black on quite a few of their designs. This one, in fact, is called Japan Black, with the poppy design on it. And here again on Alexandra shape, we have a lot of the use of black. The next thing I'd like to look at is their use of line, particularly the diagonal line. The Japanese like to divide up their designs to produce sometimes asymmetrical type looks. If you'd like to look at this next slide, we can see this is a kabuki actor on the left, and see how this design on Wileman kind of mirrors the use of the diagonal and the straight line and the angles on this kabuki actor's costume. They used lines to divide up the whole, and Wileman did this too. They divided the wares up into separate individual sections, which you don't see so much on their other patterns. Again, you can see here how this design is divided, and then it's further divided even into little subsections. Pearl Jacks should recognise this one because it's one I purchased from her in Australia. Again, you see how the use of the diagonal lines creates an interesting surface, and it just breaks up the whole pattern. And here again, this looks rather Greek looking, doesn't it? When you look into the Japan patterns, you'll notice the extreme amount of fine detail that went into them. If you look closely, every little inch of the Japan pattern, something is happening. So, you know, just right up to the very edge, you can see again this use of diagonal lines, which Wileman is using. And here again. So those of you who have Imari, it's really interesting to look at it a little bit more closely than perhaps you normally would, because the details are quite, they're not only interesting, but they reflect quite closely Japanese woodblock patterns and Japanese kimono prints. Here again is the use of lines, diagonal lines to divide up the surface. And again here, and again here. I'm not very good at pattern numbers. That's not one of my fortes. So unfortunately, I'm not going to tell you the pattern numbers of everything I show you. Most of them are from my collection, not all of them, but there we go. The other thing that the Japanese used a lot in their design were these curving fluid patterns. And these were meant to represent the sky, water, clouds, and mountains, which for the Japanese had a sacred meaning. And when you look at these Japanese patterns that I'm showing you now, this one in particular, you will see a lot on the Wileman designs. And here again, there's the Wileman using these curved patterns. This is the Japanese, and this is Japanese. So how did Wileman know that these were the prints that, you know, were being used? It's because they looked at Japanese woodblock patterns. Japanese woodblock prints were made in vast quantities from the end of the 18th century onwards, and they were made by printing the separate areas of colour individually, and they didn't show depth and perspective. The whole thing about the woodblock prints was the use of line rather than the use of, you know, trying to show depth. So these Japanese woodblock prints then influenced, again, the Western potteries and Wileman as well. Here we go with all of these curved scroll-like lines. And again here, if we go back to that woodblock print, you can see the direct comparison. See here, taken from their ideas. Again, here's another pattern with the swirling lines and one where there's just little circles. Some of the circles weren't so even, so maybe that paintress was having a bad day, but anyway. And again, here are the swirls. And see even this little tiny section in here, how it's got another different pattern going on. Now, the other thing that influenced Japanese design a lot was the use of flowers, because in Japanese culture, every flower was imbued with a secret meaning, not unlike the Victorian language of flowers in England, but this was called in Japan hana kotaba. Apologies to anyone who speaks Japan. That was probably pretty awful pronunciation. So let's look at some of the flowers that they used specifically on their wares as well. The first one is bamboo. Now, bamboo to the Japanese signified long life, friendship, peace, and harmony. Now, Wileman don't seem to have used bamboo a lot, except that in most of the wares they call Japan, the handle is often made to look like bamboo. We can see again here on this example, and sometimes when I'm trying to decide whether a design might be Japan, I'll see if it's got the bamboo handle, because sometimes that's the giveaway that it's a Japan pattern. Let's have a look now at their use of other flowers. The chrysanthemum, of course, is central to Japanese life and culture. It's the flower used by royalty. It blooms over an extended period, and it symbolised strength, courage and dignity. So here are Wileman using chrysanthemums, very stylised in some cases. In some cases, it's just a little 5-pointed star. Here again, you can see the chrysanthemum on this example. And again here. And again, in other wares, you might see it differently. We're going to show you that soon. The peony, which I think this is here, I'm not really up too much on horticulture, but I decided that that looked rather like a peony. That symbolised prosperity, happiness, love and affection, and it was called the flower of 20 days because it had a very short blooming season. The next really crucial flower in Japanese art and design is the lotus, which Wileman used extensively. The lotus is important because it represents spiritual flowering and unfolding, and also that because the lotus comes from the mud and the dirt under the water, and then it comes up to be the beautiful lotus flower, so it kind of symbolises resurrection and transformation. And here we have Wileman. Sorry that this lotus is a bit upside down. And there we have the lotus again. There are many, many Wileman designs which use the lotus, but they're just a couple of examples. Buttercups were another important flower. I'm just going to look up my notes here because I know they had something special about them. No, here we go. Buttercups symbolised riches, and it's funny that I think that possibly looks like a buttercup, but here's a there is another pattern that actually is called buttercups, which I'll show you again in a minute. This is the poppy. This particular Wileman pattern isn't called Japan. I think it's just called poppy, but I think it's in that category of patterns that should be called Japan but isn't. I'll just show you the larger plate. It uses the Imari palette. It features the poppy, and it features lots of other aspects of the Japan artistic style. So the poppy represented good luck and happiness. And you can see on this plate there's various different flowers, often quite stylised, so I don't know how much they represent the real flower. I want to look at another one, which again isn't called Japan, but it's another one that, just my own opinion, I think it should be called Japan. It's called daisy. In Japanese art, daisy symbolised faithfulness. And again, even though this isn't called Japan, it uses the Japan palette. It uses the daisy, which is a very significant flower in Japan design. So this is another one that I think is kind of on the borderline. And here again, we can see the use of stylized flowers all over the place. And this is what I meant by the star chrysanthemum being represented as a star. This is often done in Japanese art, and it's done on Wileman as well. Now I'm going to throw this one in. This is another one that's not called Japan. It's called Persian or Persia. But again, I feel when you look at the flower that looks like a chrysanthemum, when you look at the colour palette, when you look at all of these extra design elements just in this tiny little edge, I personally would class this as Japan ware. But again, I'm not an expert and I don't know that much about pattern numbers, so I may be wrong. Again, we have the red poppy, and again we have those gnarled trees, and some of the flowers I can't identify. I think that might be a buttercup, I'm not sure. Here again, we've got the poppy, and this is called, I think, Oriental poppy or just poppy, Japan. This is called Oriental poppy. And again, I think that's probably a poppy, but if there are any horticulturalists in the audience, you might be able to. So you can see, especially when we look back at that early original 17th century Japan ware, these use of these gnarled trees and use of the foliage really reminds you of those beautiful early Japanese wares. The cypress for the Japanese was the symbol of long life, and this is sideways, I'm sorry, but I'm going to show you another example of that pattern in a different colourway in the green, and you can clearly see the cypress in the centre here. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is that there were two different styles of Imari, the original Japanese Imari. There was the heavily decorated brocade style, which I showed you some examples of, but then there was another style called Kakiamon, still genuine Imari, still from that same period, but much more sparsely decorated. Both of these are examples from museums of original Kakiamon style Imari. Now, I think Wileman knew this as well, because have a look at the one we call Bird's Nest, and to me, this is that more sparse style of Imari. Again, it's got all the features of Imari ware, such as the chrysanthemum, and the Japanese in design felt that blank space was just as important as decoration. And in their music, they felt the same. So in their music, silence is often just as important in Japanese music as the music itself. Now, these are just some more examples of the flowers and decorations. The next thing I wanted to go on to was, that's a lovely Oriental poppy that came on several shapes. But you can see Wileman really went wild on the flowers, but they are flowers that are recognisably from the Japanese palette. The next thing I want to talk about is, when is Japan not Japan? And I notice we've got Carolyn Keating in the audience. and I'm going to just reference the talk that Carolyn gave at a USA conference. And she says that Japan, a pattern can be called Japan if Wileman Shelley called it Japan, if the pattern says as ... Japan, if the colours or motifs are similar to Japan pattern, if the pattern is in the Japanese style, or if an authority on Imari and Shelley would call it Imari style. This is my favourite pattern. I have an entire tea set in this. Oh, isn't that terrible? I've just forgotten the name. Help me, Helen.
Ashbourne.
Ashbourne, that's right. Now, how could you not call that Imari? Here we've got the swirly lines, we've got the chrysanthemum, we've got the palette, the cobalt blue, the red and the gold. So in my just ignorant opinion, I think there's a few patterns that were Japan that weren't called Japan. Now, as Carolyn Keating, again, I'm going to reference her. She said that we've got pictures of 54 unique designs. I have about 32 of them. I know there are others because I've seen the odd saucer or plate on eBay and thought, oh, I haven't got that pattern. So I'm always looking for new patterns that I haven't got. You do see the same patterns quite a lot on eBay and, other auction sites. When my husband and I went to Japan in 2019, we actually went to the town of Arita, which used to be called Imari, and we bought some Imari ware. This is a cautionary tale. We knew what we were buying, and we knew that it wasn't genuine Imari ware because when we looked into the back of the shop, there was a wooden crate with hundreds and hundreds of these plates. They use all of the typical design features. They're quite beautiful, but don't be fooled into thinking that it's Imari ware because it was probably made, 2 weeks ago. But I have seen these at antique fairs in Australia and in antique shops. And they're probably, people are buying them thinking that they're so-called genuine Imari, but they're not. So they're only worth a few dollars. So we were quite happy to pay a few dollars for one, but don't get fooled into thinking that they're any more than that. I was just going to show you some of the other patterns I've got which aren't called Japan. This is a very early one. It's called Dresden Flowers. But again, if you look at the palette, if you look at the representation of the flowers, if you look at the intricate decoration around the edging, I think this is a Japan pattern. It's very early. It's around the same time as that first Japan pattern was registered. This is another example of that sparser decoration, the Kiramon style. This is called Japan Black, I think. And this is a new addition to me. I think it's a lovely example of the less brocaded, more sparsely decorated Japanese patterns. I'll show you the colour because it's quite beautiful. I think this might be a little bit hard to find because I'd never seen it before. And again, you can see the cute little bamboo handle. And as I was saying before, I think this little snowdrop red poppy on the snowdrop shape is screaming, to me it's screaming Japan, but it's not called Japan. So, you know, there's still a lot we don't know. There are patterns that we probably haven't seen, but because Carolyn Keating pointed out that they gave it a different number if it was the same pattern but on a different shape. So that's a bit confusing. And I'm sorry, Carolyn, for using your work without your permission, but I'll acknowledge that you're far more up on all of this than I am. I'm not a numbers person. I can't rattle off pattern numbers. I'm a design person, and I just absolutely love the Japan pattern. I also love a few other things, but one of the things I love is the Japan pattern. And I think I'll just keep hunting for those mysterious 14 patterns that I haven't got yet in the Japan series. So if anyone would like to ask some questions, you're more than welcome. I'll hand back to Helen.